Hey guys, so we are going to review the 2 pages that you did yesterday. So yesterday you worked, we talked about elements of plot, what those were. You watched the video of me explaining Randy Riley's really big hit. We went through the different elements of plot. So I asked you guys to do this on your own. So here at the top, we're going to talk about the different pieces, the different elements of plot. Then you had two small stories that you had to read and answer some questions about those. So we're going to go over those today, so that way you'll be ready after you get finished with this to take a small quiz over the elements of plot, get a little bit more practice with that, but we are going to go over the answers first. So what I would suggest is either split screening this audio recording and your paper if you pulled that into Notability. If you weren't able to pull it into Notability or just didn't want to and wanted to just write the answers on a piece of paper or on a Google Doc, obviously you could split screen the Google Doc in this as well, or I'm pretty positive you can just pull it up with this video in the background. If not, like I said, you can split screen it or whatever you need to do, so that way you can be looking at this paper while we go over the answers. So I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to go ahead and get that set up, so either split screening that or getting that paper pulled in front of you. So 30 seconds, here we go. All right, so hopefully you've got that all set up and ready. And it's time to go over the answers. So first off, let's look at this plot diagram on the top of the first page. I want to go through the numbers, but I actually want to go, I'm not going to go through the numbers in order because I actually want to go in the order of the plot diagram. So if we look here at point A on our plot diagram, I'm hoping that we are able to find that this is the beginning, and the fancy schmancy word for the beginning of the story is going to be called that's right, the exposition. So if I can play around with this and see, there we go. Ooh, maybe. Oh no, guys. All right, you know what? Hang on, technical difficulty. Let's see if we can get it. Well, this is fun, isn't it? Okay, got it figured out. Let's try that again. So A is the exposition. So number 6 should have been, ooh, funky. Should have been A. We're going to try something different. There we go. All right, great. Let's see. B. That's where the conflict is already, we've found out the problem, the conflict, the exposition. I'm sorry, we didn't go over the exposition. So the exposition is the part where you're learning the characters, you're learning the setting, kind of laying the groundwork, the foundation for the story. It's also where we run into the problem or the conflict. And B is where that problem and conflict starts to build. Things start to get a little bit sticky for the characters in the story. Not necessarily getting to the top point, but all of those things are kind of building up to that top moment. So B here is going to be, that's right, it's number 2, the part of the story where complications arise. So that's when things are starting to get a little bit, like I said, a little bit sticky. Some of the, there we go, problems are starting to get a little bit worse. That's also a place where we call the rising action. So that should have been B. C, that's the very top point. That's where the character comes, that's kind of the turning point where things either get better or worse. That's where the character or characters meet the conflict, normally like the big battle scene or where somebody finally finds out the truth. Things kind of come to a climax, essentially, right? The answer. That's where the climax of the story, the big part of the story. So 1 should have been C. Okay. And then D, after we've come to that high point of the story, things kind of need to be tied up. So there are some loose ends that need to be tied up, things that need to kind of make a little bit more sense. We're starting to understand why the things happened that happened up here. That's going to be where the falling action. So that's going to be number 5 is where D should have been. And that the action decreases a little bit. It's not as exciting, but we kind of understand why the things that have happened in the first part of the story. And then finally, E, that's where everything gets resolved. We actually call this part the resolution. So that's going to be C. I'm sorry, 3 is going to be E. And that's just where that's kind of my and they lived happily ever after moment, where the end of the story kind of we understand where everything's going. We have tied everything up. It's just a reasonable end to the story. And then finally, number 4 says the part of the story where characters are introduced. That's all the way at the beginning, right? We learned about those characters at the very beginning. So this one should have been A as well. So double check those. Make sure that you've got those right. If not, I would suggest going back in and changing those in just a second. So that way we know we've got them in the right places, because I will let you use some of these notes on the quiz that we're getting ready to take. So make sure that you've got those in the right spot. Give you a couple seconds to double check that. All right, let's move on. So the dove and the ant are is the first little story that you would have read and answered some questions about. So I'm not going to take the time to read it because you already have, but we are going to go over the answers to the question. So let's look at number 7 first. It says, what details in the exposition, are included in the exposition of the story? So again, that's the beginning part of the story. And sometimes it's a little bit difficult to know when the exposition ends and when the rising action starts. So I want to go over this for just a second. So first off, in the exposition, they tell us about the characters. And who's the character? Yeah, the tiny ant. So tiny ant definitely could have been here. Another thing is they give us the setting. Where is this happening? Yeah, it's at the river, right? So they tell us the river or the setting of the story. Okay. Another thing is the exposition is where the conflict or the problem first shows up. And here in this next sentence, she slipped on a whetstone and plunged into the cold water. That's our problem. That's our issue, right? So all of those things could also be included in the exposition. So I'm going to shorten it up. I'm going to say whetstone and plunged into water. Here. So any of those things, you wouldn't have necessarily had to have all of them, but any of those things could have been included in the exposition. Let's look at our next question. So number 8 says, what is the first complication that arises? We just talked about what the issue was in the story. What's the first thing that happens? And that's going to be A, that the ant falls in the water, right? So you should have had A for 8. That's the very first thing that happens. And again, that's normally in the exposition right at the beginning of the rising action is where we're going to find that first complication or problem. Let's look at number 9. What is the climax of the story? Remembering that the climax is the biggest part, where the turning point, where things get really, really interesting. It's the most exciting part of the story. What is the climax of the story? Yeah, it's C. The ant stings the hunter. He's trying to save his friend, or she's trying to save her friend. Let's look back in the story. I don't know if it tells us. Yeah, her dear friend. So, she. So the ant stings the hunter. That's going to be the climax part of the story. Let's look at number 10. Which excerpt, remember we talked about excerpt before. Excerpt just means a piece of the story, a piece of a sentence from the story, is part of the rising action. The rising action is leading up to the climax, leading up to the important part. This is where the action starts actually moving a little bit in the story. So what part is a part of the rising action? We have A, B, and C. Yeah, that she slipped on the whetstone. That's where the problem arises. And that's where the issues kind of start. So we should have had A for number 10. I'm going to go up just a little bit, double checking 7, 8, 9, and 10, making sure that you have those correct. All right, great. Let's look at number 11. So number 11 says, what describes the falling action of the story? Now remember, the falling action is after the climax. This is where everything gets tied up. All of our questions finally get answered. We start understanding everything that's happened at the beginning part of the story. So what describes the falling action of the story? Yeah, the dove flies away from the hunter. If we know the climax is when the ant stings the hunter, obviously the falling action is going to start right after that. So we should have had C for number 11, when the dove flies away from the hunter. That's part of the falling action. Number 12, the moral or lesson at the end of the story. We have talked about moral and lesson a lot. Can you remember what the fancy schmancy name is for moral or lesson that starts with a T? Right, the theme, the lesson that we're supposed to learn from the story, right? Where is the moral or lesson at the end of the story? What would we call that? Yeah, it's going to be the resolution. They give us a clue by saying at the end of the story. We know the resolution is always at the end of the story. That's where the story's all wrapped up nice and pretty with a little bow and everything's finished and over. 13, what is best described as a turning point in the story? We've talked about this several times. Turning point kind of gives it away that they're asking about the climax again, right? So our climax, like we've said before, is going to be C. It's when the ant stings the hunter. That's the turning point, when things really start to change. So again, double check your 7 through 13. Make sure that you got those correct. I would ask for a thumb check right now, but I kind of can't see you, so I'm hoping that we did well on that. And then let's move on to the second story. So the second story was about a lemonade stand. And again, you've already read the story. I'm not going to reread it, but we are going to go down here and go over the answers again. So 14, what is the climax of the story? I'm not going to take as much time explaining the questions at this point because we've talked those a lot. So we're just mostly going to focus on going over the answers. That way we can double check, see how we did. So what is the climax of the story? Corey reads a sign on Tommy's wagon. That's right. C should have been your answer for 14. 15, what complication impacts Corey's plan for the day? Something I want to point out, if I was reading this question and was not sure, what complication, we've heard complication before, we know problem, impacts Corey's plan, we could use some context clues to decide what impacts means. So what do you think impacts means? You guys are so good. Yeah, how it affects his plan for the day, how it changes things, right? So what complication does impact Corey's plan for the day? It's Tommy is competing with him. He wasn't expecting that to happen, so that changes things a little bit. So we should have had B for 15. 16, what is the resolution of the story? Remember, resolution is there at the end. And how does that end? Yeah, Corey drives past Tommy on his bicycle. So we should have had A. If I can move it. For that one. Good. 17, which excerpt, again, piece of the text from the story is part of the falling action? Yeah, he attached a wagon to his bicycle. That one's going to be part of our falling action after the climax, the high point of the story. So go ahead and double check those, 14 through 17. Make sure you've got those right. Then we'll go ahead and check on the last couple of, last three questions. So 18, what is something we learn from the exposition of the story? Remember, exposition is at the beginning. Yeah, Corey's 8 years old. That gives us a little bit about the character, right? Some more information about Corey. Perfect. And 19, this excerpt, again, piece from the text, is from what part of the story? Just then he heard the ringing of a bell. Is that going to be from the exposition, the rising action, or the resolution? Man, you guys are good. Yeah, rising action, B is what we should have had for 19. And then finally, number 20, which excerpt is part of the climax? Again, the climax is that big turning point, the most exciting part of the story. Yeah, A. Mobile lemonade stand, just 50 cents a cup. That is definitely part of the climax. So, again, checking 18, 19, and 20 to make sure that you've got those. Awesome, guys. All right, so I'm hoping this practice was helpful. I'm hoping that going over these answers was helpful too. Again, if you want to use these 2 pages in your quiz that you're getting ready to take in just a second, you are more than welcome to use these as a reference. It's going to be just like these pages where you're going to have a small story that you're going to have to read, and then you'll have some questions. Actually, after this, I have the reading and the questions that you can pull into Notability if you'd like, but I actually have a quiz in Canvas that I would like you to take. So I don't want you pulling this into Notability and then saying, Mrs. Guard, I can't find where to turn in my quiz. It's because I don't want you turning this paper in. I actually just want you taking the quiz. So if you need to, the reason that I put the story like this into Canvas is so if you would like to split screen between the quiz and the story, you have the opportunity to do so. So make sure if you have any questions to send me a message, and I'll be happy to try to answer those before you do take your quiz if there's something that you need clarified or you didn't understand why we chose one of the answers that we chose before you take your quiz. Please make sure that you Canvas message me, and I'll be more than happy to go over it with you. Other than that, good luck. Go ahead and move on to the next page where you're going to read the story and then take the quiz.